You're listening to the Doctor Is In podcast. This is the show where you get the best tips, tricks, and nutritional hacks to help you and your family get healthier. You'll also hear what works and what doesn't work so you don't have to waste your time and money. All right, let's get started.
Hello, I'm Dr. Martin Jr.
And I'm Dr. Martin Sr.
And this is the Doctors In podcast, and this is episode 153. And today we want to talk about a couple of studies that came out in the last 2 weeks, some of them newer than that, but we find quite interesting, and it really deals with a lot of the questions that we get asked about sweeteners, specifically like non-caloric artificial sweeteners type things, and also sugary drinks. So we'll talk about those two things, two fascinating studies that really it's not surprising, however, very practical because it involves a big portion of the population. So what we'll do is we'll start off talking about a study that was just done on sucralose, which is another name for Splenda. And what's interesting is we get a lot of people emailing us or asking us questions about all these different types of sweeteners. You know, what do you think of this one? What do you think of that one? You know, what do you think of this one? So then you have a lot of quote-unquote natural sweeteners, and then you have these other more synthetic types like the Splendas and the aspartame and all that kind of stuff, right? Yep. So we get a lot of people asking us this because, rightfully so, I mean, they want to throw some of these things into the foods that they're eating, and they want to know what we think about them. Now, information on these things are coming fast and furious in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the jury was out on the artificial sweeteners for a long time. You know, you sort of knew that they weren't, because patients used to ask me in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s.
It was saccharin back then.
Yeah, right. And I remember my dad. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day. You know, my father found out in 1967. I'll never forget because, you know, he had been unwell for a couple of weeks, and I didn't know what was going on. I was 15 or 16. My mom was saying, Dad's getting some tests done, and he's not feeling that good. And, you know, that worried me to some extent. But he come home one day. I'll never forget. He said, well, I'm a diabetic. And, okay, like I knew my grandfather had died of diabetes, but I didn't know anything much more than that. But you know what? I saw my dad. It was incredible. Like completely changes. Well, one of the things, he got up the next morning, and I'm not kidding you. My dad was running on the spot on the carpets, and I thought he was crazy. Like, what?
He was jogging before people were jogging.
He was jogging before people were jogging, and my mom kicked him out of the house because she said, you're going to ruin my carpets, right?
Now, here's the thing. Did he ever reverse his diabetes?
No.
See, it's interesting, right? Because now all the information is coming out. You could pretty much reverse or put into remission.
Well, two things. My dad didn't reverse his diabetes because even though he big time changed his diet, he really did. I mean, my dad literally had steak 5-6 days a week. My mom would make him, he'd always come home later anyways from the office, but my dad would get a steak like every night. Whatever we had, my dad didn't eat because he knew enough that he had to cut out his sugar. My dad cut out all his sugar, wouldn't have dessert anymore, whatever. So, you know what the problem was? He drank too much.
Yeah, and that's
you know, he had too much. My dad still loved his wine. My dad still loved to drink.
Yeah, now we know how hard it is to control insulin and blood sugar.
On the artificial sweeteners, I just want to say one thing. My dad, I laugh because you have never tasted anything as awful as the first diet sodas that came out. They were called, Tab. And Tab, you have never tasted any. It was like rat poison. I said, Dad, what are you drinking? But he was so concerned about his blood sugars that he wouldn't drink pop. He wouldn't put it in. Like if he was having a rye and Coke, my dad wouldn't have rye and Coke. Well, in those days, they didn't have the Diet Coke yet. So that's how far back it goes with artificial. But the first ones were horrendous. There was no way they knew how to make them taste any good. They were, I mean, it was gagging. It was so bad.
And now it's a massive industry. There are so many of them out there, and it seems like there's a new one coming out all the time, right? So it's a legitimate question that people ask us. And we kind of, over the years, have used kind of three questions that we ask about a sweetener as we evaluate it. And sometimes the information is just not available yet. But generally, these are how we approach any sweetener. The first question we ask is, does it affect blood sugar levels, right? And a lot of them don't. A lot of them don't affect blood sugar levels. The second question we ask is, does it affect insulin levels? And that's harder to know. However, more research is being done, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is that a lot of these may not trigger a actual blood sugar effect, but it may trigger a little bit of an insulin spike. And especially if somebody is really metabolically damaged. So imagine a 0-calorie sweetener triggering a little bit of an insulin response, or does it affect insulin down the road? And that's what we're going to talk about in the study that came out. So that's the second question. So first is, does it affect your blood sugar levels? 2 is, does it affect insulin one way or the other? And the third question is, does it kill your good bacteria? Because we're finding out a lot of these sweeteners kill or affect your microbiome, your good bacteria. And that's never a good thing, right? It's never. So those are kind of, and like I said, the information on them is difficult to know to answer those 3 questions. So if we can't answer those 3 questions, it's kind of like one of those things, buyer beware, in a sense. We don't know. The data may be there in a few years, but at this point now, we would recommend something that we know doesn't affect sugar, doesn't affect insulin, or doesn't kill your good bacteria, right? So that's what we would recommend, but they're not in all foods. You can use them for baking. I mean, you can buy them for baking, but to go buy a diet food, in a sense, or a diet soda or diet pop, depending on where you're from. I say diet pop. My wife would say diet soda. But depending on where you're from, they come with very specific sweeteners. For example, in Canada, diet drinks here still use aspartame, but in the States, like Diet Pepsi, Diet Coke, and all that, they've switched to Splenda. And if you buy, people love yogurt, and people were eating yogurt like crazy. Then they found out that yogurt was very sugary, so then they started adding like aspartame or Splenda. So it's in a lot of foods, right? Yeah. And those are really commercial grade sweeteners because they're in a lot of the main foods. You know what's funny is I saw a commercial last night because I was watching a hockey game like 5 times on yogurt, and it's called like 000 yogurt. It's a little
no fat.
Yeah, it's a little off topic. It's like 000, so like 0 fat. I kept on watching it, and I was thinking, well, I think you want a yogurt with fat. I may be wrong on that one, but I mean the evidence is pretty clear. And then it said like 0 artificial sweeteners. Okay, that's great. And they said, oh, and it has 25% less sugar. So what they're saying is somebody would rather have sugar than an artificial sweetener. And that's a question we get asked all the time. Like people ask us this, is it better to drink a diet Pepsi or a regular Pepsi? Well, the answer to that question is that, well, it depends, right? Are you a diabetic?
Well, first of all, neither one of them is good.
No, that's what I mean. If somebody says, gun to your head, which one should you drink? Well, again, a diabetic should definitely be staying away from a sugary drink. There's no question.
But when you look at, here's how I look at it, because when you look at the way the world is today, where the average North American is consuming 180 to 200 pounds of sugar a year, I would tell them, look, if you're going to, I don't like it, I hold my nose when I say it, but you're better off probably having an artificial Diet Pepsi or Diet Coke compared to a Pepsi, because I just cannot fathom in this day and age with what we see in our clinic, people that are so stinking insulin resistant that when you put 12, 14 teaspoons of sugar into
insane.
A drink, I just think that
and we'll talk about the 2 studies
poison.
That kind of would not back that up in a sense, but I mean, we get asked that question a lot. So first, let's talk about Splenda, right? Because that's in a lot of things.
Yeah, that's huge now.
And that one there is exploded onto the scene, and a lot of foods now have replaced aspartame.
And they sort of almost tell you like it's more natural.
Well, yeah, they'll say it's more natural
than aspartame.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. So one of the questions, again, if we were to evaluate, is does it affect sugar level? And the research on that is it does not affect blood sugar level. Mm-hmm. The next question is does it affect insulin? And here's what's interesting. A study that just came out not long ago, again, is saying this. Consumption of Splenda or sucralose will decrease your insulin sensitivity, even in health. And this was done in healthy subjects. So what does that mean? Why is that important? Well, there are 2 terms that you should probably know to understand why this is a big thing. One is insulin resistance. And the other one is insulin sensitive.
Good.
That's right. Now, when you are For example, once you consume sugar or a food that breaks down quickly, your blood sugar levels spike up really quickly, right? And in a soda or a pop, a sugary drink, fruit juices, in the newsletter we called it Starbucks, Frappa, whatever they call it. There's so many of them now.
But any fruit juice.
Yeah, so what ends up happening is because there's nothing to digest, it goes into your bloodstream very quickly. Your sugar levels just shoot straight up. And then what happens is you have to lower that down because it's...
What goes up must come down.
Yeah, and blood sugar is very toxic. You don't need a lot of it, so you have to bring it down quickly. Like if you have high blood sugar level for too long, that's diabetes, that's dangerous. And if it's too low, that's dangerous as well, right? So it's very, very tightly regulated. However, in order to bring the blood sugar back down, your body will secrete insulin, and insulin will help lower your blood sugar levels down. And that's what normally happens throughout the day, right? You eat a food, your blood sugar level goes up, your insulin level goes up, blood sugar level comes down, and then insulin level slowly comes down over a period of time. And that's pretty much what happens throughout the day. The higher the spike in sugar, that's bad. It just causes your body to overreact. But anyways, what happens with insulin resistance is because you've been doing that so much, your cells basically just stop listening.
Yeah, they hate insulin.
They
hate
just
the presence of it.
They just don't react the same way. So now what happens? The body can only do one thing. It's like, hey, if I'm going to make a little bit of insulin and you're not going to listen, I'm going to make more insulin. And then the cells listen again. Then eventually you become more insulin resistance, and the body says, all right, I'm just going to make even more. And that's what happens, right? So when a person is insulin resistant, they need more insulin to get the same job done. That's never a good thing.
No.
So they end up with a condition that you and I call all the time, and it's really the foundation for a lot of disease, which is high circulating insulin, because they always have insulin circulating in their system because they always need to lower their blood sugar, and they make so much of it, they can't clear it out that quickly. On the flip side is something called insulin sensitivity.
Good.
Which is very good, because when you are sensitive to insulin, when your cells are sensitive to insulin, it doesn't need much. Your body can secrete just a little bit of insulin, and it's going to get the same job done. So then you have lower insulin levels, and everything functions better. You feel better. You have less inflammation. You're less likely to get all these different types of diseases. So you want to be insulin sensitive, right? And there are certain things that you could do to increase insulin sensitivity. We've talked about this before. Fasting is one. It increases insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, big time. It really does.
Weight training.
Yeah, weight training.
Good exercise, but weight training, high intensity interval training really affect your insulin sensitivity, makes you way more insulin sensitive, right? There's a few things that you could do on the side. However, so this study in Splenda, which was fascinating, found that a healthy individual, so these are not even people that are metabolically damaged, so you can imagine the effect it has on somebody who already has a little bit of a metabolic disorder going on. They found that consuming Splenda for a couple of weeks decreased their insulin sensitivity. So even though it wouldn't affect insulin at the moment, it's not like you're going to release insulin necessarily when you're drinking Splenda. However, the next time you go to eat sugar or eat a carbs that you need insulin, you're going to need a little bit more. So that's really a first step towards a problem. That's the thing. So here you have somebody who's healthy. They consume Splenda for a few weeks, and they found out that it actually affects their insulin sensitivity. So that's not a good thing. That alone would be a reason to limit or avoid Splenda as much as possible, let alone the fact that it kills your good bacteria as well.
Yeah, because we had talked about that, I think, on a previous podcast.
Yeah, so Splenda really would fail 2 of the 3 criteria that we would use to evaluate an artificial sweetener. Now, I mean, listen, we can go next level deep and then talk about how long does it stay in your system? Does it affect your neurology at all? Is it a toxin? I mean, those are a lot of ways to evaluate, and there's a lot of data on both sides sometimes, right? Because you can imagine big sugar companies don't like artificial sweeteners, and there's a lot of fog of war between them in a sense, right? Like it's hard to sometimes know what you're reading. But anyways, at the end of the day, Splenda, based even on our simple criteria, is not ideal in any way. So that would tell you to limit Splenda or avoid it if you can. If you are going to consume Splenda, then you want to take a probiotic, and just bear in mind that it's going to affect how you respond to carbs later on that day. So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think that a little chemical, a few grams of something can affect your biochemistry that much, which is amazing to think about. It's not like they're consuming a ton of it. They're just a small dosage for a couple weeks will affect how your body reacts to things. It's amazing. To me, that's the amazing thing about these chemicals, the stuff that they can do inside your system.
Well, your body doesn't know what it is, really. Your body was never made for that, right? Even to detect that. And so, the human body is fearfully and wonderfully made, but it was never made really to have to deal with chemicals, right? The chemicals just a new thing in the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah, and some stuff just your body can handle. Okay, no big deal. Other things...
I mean, you don't croak right away, right?
No, and a lot of chemicals now mimic estrogen, so even though you may dispose of that chemical, your body reacts as if it's just come into contact with estrogen, so you get this real imbalance between estrogen and progesterone if you're a woman. If you're a man, you get a real imbalance between estrogen and testosterone, and that creates a lot of issues in men. We're coming out with a natural testosterone booster we've been working on for a while that's coming out shortly, and so we've been doing a lot of reading on testosterone again, and that's a big problem in men as well, right? So I mean, it's just amazing to think what these chemicals do. So that's the first thing we wanted to talk about based off of a study, and I hope that answers some questions on artificial sweeteners. Now, the second thing we want to do is look at another study that I find equally fascinating. And so earlier this year, we did a newsletter on if I wanted to do a study today, and part of my study, I wanted to look at, for example, the effects of obesity, or I wanted to look at the effects of type 2 diabetes, and I wanted to do it in mice, right? I wanted to do a lab experiment. Then, well, I'd have to somehow get that mouse to get fat, right? I'd have to fatten up that mouse for the study. So they use like a chow it's kind of like a rat chow or a mouse chow, and it's really a combination of high carb, processed carb, high junky fats like vegetable oils, right? So it's a combination of high carb, high fat vegetable oil. So real inflammatory. It's a real disruptor of hormones, and it just causes a rapid fat gain. Think potato chips, basically, but they're not potato chips. It's like a combination of all these things, right?
Puts in.
Yeah, all those things, like the worst combination. And that's the point. The worst combination. The worst thing you could do nutritionally, really, is combine carbs and fat at the same time, right? They're not really found in nature. I mean, that's just so unfortunately the way it is, right? And a lot of the foods that we like. So imagine the two best things that make food taste awesome, which is fat and sweetness, right? I mean, that's like your brain is just like exploding. All the neurotransmitters are like popping like fireworks in your brain. It gets really excited. So that's why. I mean, but it's a terrible combination. It is used.
You mean milkshakes are no good for you?
Yeah, all those things, especially like the old-fashioned. Oh yeah, I mean, it's just
ice cream and
highly insulinogenic foods, right? But that's what they would do for a mouse, and it would cause rapid weight gain, which a lot of good dietary advice is basically you can do. We're massive fans of low carb, obviously, because we see the effect that it has and the benefits it has on people's health. But you could do low carb. You better do low carb and high fat. You better not do both. You better not do high fat, high carb, because that's just a recipe for disaster. You could do high carb, low fat, but it's been a failed experiment for a long time, right? It's very difficult to do. But at the end of the day, you just don't want to combine carbs and fat. You just you just don't want to do that as a rule of thumb. So that's the first thing that we talked about in the study a while ago. But a new study's coming out as well talking, and this is another way to rapidly gain weight, rapidly gain fat, rapidly put fat around your liver, right? And it's, of course, we're talking about drinking your sugar.
Yeah.
There's something especially nasty that goes on inside your body when you drink sugar. I mean, sugar in food has its issues, at least if it may take longer to digest. It will spike your sugars, but it's not going to be as quick and it's not going to be as violent. Sugary drinks just cause an absolute explosion of blood sugar levels. It just creates so it's interesting. This study looked at the effect that sugary drinks have on our bodies, right? So we had talked about what happens biochemistry-wise when you have a real sugary drink. But what they found is the insulin levels never really quite come back down for the rest of the day. They always because it shoots it up so much, your body overreacts for a long time after. And it's not like you're not going to eat again. So this never comes back down between meals after. And they found that 2 sugary drinks a day is all it took to keep insulin up all day. Just pancreas never gets a break. So again, when that happens, see, and this is something that people have to understand is when you have insulin present, lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat for energy, stops.
Yeah, stops.
Insulin.
I love your thing with when you put on the PowerPoint as part of our program, Serial Killers Revisited, and also in the Metabolic Storm, you see fat that's behind bars, and the jail guard is insulin. Right?
Yeah, it just won't let it out.
It won't let it out. If you got insulin present, think about that. If because a lot of people too, as you were saying, when you think of it, like they even think they're drinking healthy, so they're
having
juicing.
like a big fruit smoothie.
Yeah. And, like I tell people, don't do that.
No, especially,
like you can have protein powder drinks and whatever, but don't flavor don't make them, maybe a few berries, but I wouldn't throw a banana in there, and I wouldn't throw, and then now you got a very sweet, it's the same thing. Your body.
It spikes it faster than it should. It digests faster than it should, right? Yeah. And then the worst thing you can do after that is do all that and add a ton of fat to it, right? Like, we love fat, but it has to be in context. Mm-hmm. You can't just have a high carb diet and then just start consuming all this fat and thinking you're going to be healthy, and that's not how it works. It doesn't work that way. And at the end of the day, you're going to store something. And if you consume a ton of carbs and a ton of fat, you're going to burn the carbs off for energy, but that fat never breaks down. It's just going to get eventually stored as fat. And people say, well, they hear us say fat doesn't get stored as fat, which is true. However, in the presence of a ton of carbohydrates, yeah, it does. Yeah. Anything can get stored as fat, right? Yeah. So it's not like anything has that possibility. So basically, if you're consuming sugary drinks, it is just causing a ton of issues inside your body. It's causing fatty liver. It's causing spiked insulin. It's stopping your body's ability to use fat as energy, so you're in a storage mode. Basically, bad news. Yeah. Bad news. Now, as a hypothetical, people ask this all the time, should I have a diet drink or a sugary drink? And it's so funny because on the one hand, we know now with with Splenda, it can affect how your body responds to insulin down the road, but it doesn't have the same insulin effect as a sugary drink does. Plus, the sugary drink has a ton of calories. It's a ton of energy that you just don't need, so your body has to do something, has to store it somewhere. So it makes for a really interesting hypothetical. I mean, they're both bad outcomes. There's no question. My kids like doing this all the time. They like giving me hypotheticals, and I don't play along ever. I'm like, well, no, why would anybody in the world ever force me to make a decision between those 2 points? And they're like, just answer, just play along. And I'm like, well, it makes no sense. Why would somebody give those only 2 choices on the planet? But hypothetically, if there was only 2 choices, it makes for an interesting discussion, right? And again, if you already have diabetes, and there's no question, right? That's why we always say water, sparkling water, right? All those kind of things. Coffee's, and that's another way. Coffee helps improve insulin sensitivity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, which is another reason why we love coffee. So anyways, a couple of really interesting studies. And I guess let's just end this off. We're out of time. But it's something that you had mentioned just before coming on the podcast. We were talking about these sugary drinks and the effect it has on uric acid, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and I just read this morning, actually, and I mentioned it, I think, on Facebook today, that a new study come out that shows, so let's say you do have a soft drink or you drink an orange juice or whatever, within an hour, your uric acid levels spike through the roof. And again, what is uric acid, right? Like, uric acid is obviously, it's very pro-inflammatory. It damages, I believe, over a period of time, can it damage your joints. It's a reason for a lot of unexplained pain, because a lot of people think I got arthritis. Yeah, but what kind of arthritis?
Even think of the effect it has on kidney stones.
Exactly.
Right? A lot of people will never attribute drinking soda or pop to kidney stones.
Yeah. And, so you're... And uric acid is it's a negative thing in the body because it's like I said, it's very Because a lot of people will ask us, what do we do in our office, in our biomarker? What are we looking for inflammation markers? Well, one of them is uric acid. Because uric acid, insulin creates inflammation, but uric acid, this is why we always tell people, look, are you a big fruit eater? And they say, yeah, isn't that good? Well, not if you're making uric acid. I wouldn't have a lot of it. I call them God's candies. Like you can have berries and stuff like that, but don't live on bananas and grapes. And I'm not saying never have any, but don't have a lot of that because, again, the world's changed today. We're dealing with we have had a complete change now because of the amount of sugar. Like I said, we're on around 200 pounds of sugar a year. Body was never made for that. Body can't deal with that. And this is why we're seeing such an enormous raise in the levels of uric acid. I see it every day in the office. And I always tell people, look, your sin will find you out. Like you're consuming too much sugar and sometimes even too much fruit for them. And I say, well, look, you just can't have that anymore. Not like the way you used to, right?
Yeah. So, just fascinating stuff. So anyways, I hope this information was helpful. It answers two of the questions we get asked a lot of times. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at info@martinclinic.com. You can go to our website, martinclinic.com, and you can sign up for our newsletters there. We put a lot of these things out in newsletters as well. Also, every Thursday morning, you do a Facebook Live. I get a ton of people there asking a lot of questions. We also have a private Facebook group, Martin Clinic Club, where you can go in there and awesome conversations, right?
Yeah, it's really good.
I enjoy reading some of the stuff in there. It's really interesting. So you could join that as well. So there's a lot of ways to get a hold of us, a lot of ways to ask us questions. So again, we want to thank you for listening and have a great day.